Hello and welcome to Neurosurgery Written Board Crash Course. My name is Chen, and in this video we'll be talking about the cerebellar afferents. Here we've listed the afferent tracts to the cerebellum. And the first three that are listed here are the major tracts that we talked about in the previous videos. These are the direct afferents from the spinal cord, the cerebral cortex, and the vestibular centers. And to recap, the spinocerebellar tracts conveys information between the spinal cord and the paleocerebellum. And the Cerebral-ponto-cerebellar tracts, also known as the Cortico-ponto-cerebellar tracts, conveys information between the cortex, the pons, and the neocerebellum. And the Vestibulo-cerebellar tracts conveys information between the vestibular nerve and the vestibular nucleus with the flocculonodular system of the cerebellum. There are other systems that also conducts information to and from the cerebellum, and these are listed here. And some of the centers are the inferior olivary nucleus to the cerebellum, the tectum of the midbrain to the cerebellum, and the trigeminal nucleus to the cerebellum, and the reticular formation to the cerebellum. And we will go over each of these in more detail. When it comes to the spinocerebellar tracts, there are a few varieties of these tracts, and namely there are four of them: these dorsal spinocerebellar tracts, the ventral spinocerebellar tracts, and the cuneocerebellar tracts, and the rostral spinocerebellar tracts. The dorsal spinocerebellar tracts conveys proprioceptive information, and all of them conveys spinal proprioceptive information. The dorsal spinocerebellar tract conveys proprioceptive information from muscle spindles, and they're conveyed by 1A fibers. And the ventral spinocerebellar tracts conveys proprioceptive information conveyed by the joints and Golgi tendons and are carried by 1B fibers. And this is the basis of the spinal reflex curve. The dorsal and the ventral spinocerebellar tracts are responsible for lower extremity proprioceptions, while the cuneocerebellar and the rostral spinocerebellar tracts are responsible for upper extremity proprioceptions. The cuneocerebellar tracts is the upper equivalent of the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts, and the rostral spinocerebellar tract is the upper equivalent of the ventral spinocerebellar tracts. And here is a summary figure of their general pathways, and we'll go over each one in detail, but notice how every tracts go through, ascend through the spinal cord and the brainstem ipsilaterally, except for one tract, which is the ventral spinocerebellar tracts, only to cross again within the cerebellum back to the ipsilateral side. And so this is known as a double crossing of the spinocerebellar tracts. And notice that only the ventral spinocerebellar tracts go through the superior cerebellar peduncle, while everything else goes through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The pathway that the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts travels is as follows. The proprioceptive information goes to the dorsal root ganglia and enters the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and then travels to the Clark's nucleus in lamina 7 of the intermediate zone in the spinal cord. And we covered the Clark's nucleus in the lamina video, and you can refer to that video for more information. And information then travels to the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts in the lateral funiculus, and this is the lateral funiculus right here of the spinal cord, and it eventually ascends. Now the posterior spinocerebellar tracts is the same as the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts, and so the axons, after traveling to the lateral funiculus, will ascend ipsilaterally along the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts in the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord, and eventually reaches the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellar vermis and intermediate zone of the cerebellum, as well as the vestigial and interposed nuclei. And similarly, as we said before, the Cuneocerebellar tracts is the upper extremity equivalent of the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts. And the proprioceptive information of the upper extremity enters the dorsal root ganglia to the dorsal horn and travel to the fasciculus cuneatus in the dorsal column instead of the lateral funiculus over here. And it ascends ipsilaterally to the accessory cuneate nucleus, which is also known as the lateral cuneate nucleus, in the caudal medulla above the cuneate nucleus. And it then enters the inferior cerebellar peduncle ipsilaterally to enter the cerebellum. And this is a demonstration of a summary of the two tracts that we talked about, and notice how the upper extremity is conveyed by the Cuneocerebellar tracts via the accessory cuneate nucleus, via the ipsilateral inferior cerebellar peduncle, while the dorsal spinal cerebellar tracts conveys information of the lower extremity. In terms of the ventral spinocerebellar tracts, proprioceptive information from joints and Golgi tendons goes to the dorsal root ganglia and then enters the dorsal horn, and instead of synapsing on the Clark's nucleus, it instead synapses on the spinal border cells in the anterior and intermediate horns of the spinal cord. And the tract then crosses the midline within the spinal cord in the anterior white commissure to the contralateral side into the ventral spinocerebellar tracts. And after it crosses the midline into the spinal cerebellar tract, the ventral spinocerebellar tracts, which is also known as the anterior spinocerebellar tracts, it then ascends in the contralateral side in the ventral spinocerebellar tracts and eventually will end up in the superior cerebellar peduncle and to go into the cerebellum. And it then crosses again in the cerebellum, so it becomes a double-crossed system. And notice this from the summary slide before that there is also another tracts that we talked about, the rostral spinocerebellar tracts, which is the upper extremity equivalent of the ventral spinocerebellar tracts. But it is an ipsilateral system, and instead of going through the superior cerebellar tracts like the ventral spinocerebellar tracts, the rostral spinocerebellar tracts will go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And here's a summary slide of the efferents to the cerebellum. And notice how only the ventral spinocerebellar tracts go through the superior cerebellar peduncle, while dorsal as well as cuneo-rostral spinocerebellar tracts all go through the inferior peduncle. And I typically think of this as parallel lines that don't intersect each other. And what I mean is that if you have the ventral spinocerebellar tracts, which is more anterior, going through the superior cerebellar peduncle, you're not going to intersect any of the other lines that travel more dorsally. Versus the opposite around, if you have the ventral spinocerebellar tracts going through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, this is going to cross with the dorsal cerebellar peduncle ascending into the superior peduncle. And so it's better to have two parallel lines that ascend together and that don't intersect each other, and therefore I think that the ventral spinocerebellar tracts goes a little bit further into the superior cerebellar peduncle, just to not cross with the other three lines. The next big tracts is the Cortico-ponto-cerebellar tracts. The fibers originate in the cerebral cortex, such as the motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and the somatosensory cortex, as well as temporal lobes. And they will descend via the cerebral peduncle on both edges of the cerebral peduncle, and more specifically, the frontal and parietal lobes will go through the medial edge of the cerebral peduncle in tracts called frontal pontine fibers, whereas the temporal lobe fibers will descend out laterally in the cerebral peduncle in the tracts called the temporal pontine fibers, and they eventually will descend and synapse around the deep pontine nuclei. And these deep pontine nuclei will then send tracts to the cerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncle. And remember, we said before that the middle cerebellar peduncle connects between the pons and the cerebellum, and so it only makes sense for these tracts to go through the middle cerebellar peduncle. And in terms of the end location of the cerebellum receptive areas, it will be the cerebral cerebellum, which is the bulk of the cerebellar hemisphere, as we talked before. The vestibulo-cerebellar tracts, as the name suggests, monitors head position, eye movements, and equilibrium. And we'll cover a lot of the mechanisms with regards to eye movements and head positions when it comes to the vestibular system in the cranial nerve videos. But in general, the vestibulo-cerebellar system conveys reciprocal information between vestibular nerve, the vestibular nucleus, the flocculonodular lobe, and the vestigial nucleus of the cerebellum. The flocculonodular lobe and the adjacent portion of the vermis, plus the vestigial nucleus, are together considered a single unit that functions together and is called the vestibulo-cerebellar module. And they receive afferents from the ipsilateral vestibular nerve directly and or the vestibular nuclei. The traffic for vestibulo-cerebellar system is carried within the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and one particular subdivision of the inferior cerebellar peduncle called the juxtarexiform body, and we'll cover that in future videos. The inferior cerebellar peduncle is comprised of both the juxtarexiform and the resiform bodies. And remember, we said that the input from the outside of the cerebellum first will have to go to the cerebellar cortex, and then the cerebellar cortex conveys information to the deep nuclei, and then the deep nuclei conveys information out of the cerebellum. And this system, this vestibulo-cerebellar system, is the biggest exception to that rule of thumb. So the vestibular nerve will either go directly to the cerebellar cortex, the flocculonodular lobe, or it will synapse on the vestibular nuclei that then will go to the cortex, the cerebellar cortex. Or it will go directly to the vestigial nucleus or synapse on the vestibular nuclei and then go to the vestigial nucleus. The output system is also an exception to the rule of thumb. The flocculonodular lobe can either transmit signal directly out of the cerebellum, or it can go first to the vestigial nucleus and then go out of the cerebellum. The vestibulo-cerebellar fibers access the flocculonodular cortex and the vestigial nucleus to convey information concerning the position of the head and the body in space, as we talked about before. And it also conveys information useful in orienting the eye movement during movement when we turn our heads. And these information are supplemented by inputs from other systems, and some of those includes the inferior olivary complex from the olivary nucleus, and as well as the ponto-cerebellar fibers from the cerebral cortex. And these pathways convey indirect pathways and inputs from nuclei of the brainstem and the cerebrum, which are concerned with a broad spectrum of information regarding visual processing and eye movements. We kind of alluded to the olivo-cerebellar fibers when we talked about the climbing fibers. And these fibers arise from the inferior olivary nucleus in the medulla. And after taking the origin in the inferior olivary nucleus, the fibers, the tracts, then climb up, and hence the name climbing fibers, across the midline into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And this tract eventually reaches the spinal cerebellum. And this tract also gives collaterals to the cerebellar nuclei, particularly in the interposed nuclei, which eventually will also contribute to the rubrospinal tracts and controlling the posture of the body. The inferior olivary nucleus will also receive afferent fibers from, in general, three sources. The brainstem nuclei of the same side, for example, the red nucleus. The spinal cord through the spinal olivary tracts of the same side, and as well as the cerebral cortex of the opposite side. And so essentially, the olivo-cerebellar tract is kind of a relay station that conveys proprioceptive impulses from the rest of the body, as well as the output signals from the cerebral cortex into the spinal cerebellum. The tectocerebellar tracts travels between the tectum and the cerebellum. The primary source of the tectocerebellar tracts is the superior and inferior colliculus. The superior colliculus carries visual information, and the inferior colliculus carries auditory information. And we'll cover more about them in the brainstem videos. The information from the colliculi then travels via the anterior medullary velum and then into the superior cerebellar peduncle into the cerebellum. And the anterior medullary velum is what constitutes the roof of the fourth ventricle as seen here. And on a mid-sagittal view, you can see that the superior medullary velum is right underneath the tectum of the midbrain, as you can see here on the MRI slides here. And so it's not very hard to imagine signals traveling all the way down here and out laterally via the superior cerebellar peduncle into the cerebellum. And this tract controls movement of the head and neck in response to auditory and visual stimuli. Now, the proprioceptive information is also conveyed by the trigeminal nerve, and so it's not hard to imagine that the trigeminal nerve will also contribute to input to the cerebellum, and so hence there is a tract called the Trigemino-cerebellar tract. And there are three major trigeminal nuclei that are listed here, namely the mesencephalic trigeminal nucleus, the chief sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And we'll cover more about them in the cranial nerve videos, but suffice it to say that the proprioceptive information is mostly carried of the face is carried mostly by the mesencephalic nucleus, and this is conveyed, the input is conveyed via the superior cerebellar peduncle into the cerebellum. And here are some summary figures of the inputs and outputs into and out of the cerebellum via the different cerebellar peduncles that I found was pretty helpful when it comes to reviewing the aggregates of the efferent and efferent connections. So the cerebellar cortex will send outputs via the Purkinje cells, which is the only output cell type in the cerebellum. And these Purkinje cells will use inhibitory GABA neurotransmitters, and so the outputs are therefore always tonically inhibitory. And these signals will travel to deep cerebellar nuclei and provides a tonic inhibition. And the deep nuclei will also receive information from outside of the cerebellum, mostly to provide signals to overcome this tonic inhibition. And so after compiling all the signals, eventually the deep nuclei will send output out of the cerebellum via the cerebellar peduncles. And here are listed some of the major destinations of the efferent connections, and we will talk about the deep nuclei and the efferent pathways in the next video. These are my references. I hope you find these helpful, and I'll see you next time.